These contained a digest of the laws of the ancient Roman Empire, which henceforward became the law of the 10 Kingdoms. Gibbon remarks that, by the execution of this work, quote, Justinian, the Greek emperor of Constantinople and the East, was the legal successor of the Latinian shepherd, who had planted a colony on the banks of the Tiber, unquote. Much more would we remark what is true of the 10 Kingdoms, which now began to be governed by the laws of ancient Rome, and into which the very spirit of Rome was thus infused, that it had now become the legal successor of that Latin kingdom which Romulus founded on the banks of the Tiber. The promulgation of the Justinian Code seems to mark the epoch of the full emergence of the 10-horned beast above the Gothic flood. The 10 Kingdoms then became the true lineal descendant of pagan Rome. But what of the papacy? Was there about the same time any signal enlargement or confirmation of the powers of the Pope? It was just at this time that Justinian issued his famous decretal epistle to the Pope, in which he recognized him as the head of all holy churches, not the head of the churches of the Western Empire only, but of the Eastern also. Roman Catholics themselves have acknowledged this to be the first imperial recognition of the absolute primacy of the Pope. Then it was that the Pope assumed the blasphemous title of Christ Vicar, a character which forms the basis of that authority which the Pope claims over temporal sovereigns. Christ is King of Kings, and were the Pope really Christ's Vicar, he would be a King of Kings too. Thus, in the assumption of the title and character of Christ's Vicar, the Antichrist was revealed. And it's remarkable that at the same period we find a remarkable change taking place both in the constitution of the 10 Kingdoms and in the character of their real head. We find the former becoming Roman kingdoms, and the latter Christ's Vicar, i.e. Antichrist. From this period, then we are disposed to date the commencement of the 1260 years, during which the witnesses prophesied in sackcloth, prophesied clothed in sackcloth. 70 years later, we find another strongly marked epoch in the history of the papacy. In 606 AD, the Emperor Phocas, Emperor Phocas confirmed by his decree what Justinian had done by constituting the Pope universal bishop and requiring all the churches to acknowledge the papal supremacy. And in AD 608, Phocas gave Pope Boniface the Pantheon, which, from being a temple originally dedicated to all the pagan gods, was henceforward dedicated to the worship of the Virgin Mary and all the martyrs. It had been the high place of pagan idolatry, and now it became the high place of the Antichrist, the anti-Christian idolatry. We would request our readers especially to mark these two stages in the rise of the papacy. They are Justinian's edict in AD 533 and Focus edict in AD 606. Others have traced yet a third stage in the rise of the papacy, an era of Charlemagne. Charlemagne, king of France, was crowned emperor of the Romans by Pope Leo in AD 800. By the help of Charlemagne, the Pope's temporal authority was enlarged and confirmed. 3 of the 10 kings whose territory adjoined the Roman See being abolished and the Pope being vested in their authority and their territories, thus fulfilling the prophecy of Daniel that the 3 of the horns should be plucked up before the little horn, from which of these 3 epochs are we to date the commencement of the 1260 years? The opinion entertained by some that there may be a double or perhaps even treble commencement of this period is very probable and may turn out to be true. It is countenanced by a prediction long since fulfilled. The quote-unquote 70 weeks of Daniel determined the length of the captivity in Babylon. But there was at 3 several times a carrying away. And of course, the question came to be from which of these periods the commencement of the 70 weeks should be dated. It was found that as there were 3 stages in the captivity, so were 3 corresponding stages in the return, with exactly 70 weeks between each corresponding stage. So, to the 3 stages in the rise of the papacy, there may be 3 answering stages in its downfall and total extinction. If we date the commencement of the 1260 years from the era of Justinian, AD 533, we are brought down to 1793. If we date the era of Focus, 606 AD, we are brought down to 1866 AD. And if we date from the era of Charlemagne, AD 800, we cannot look to the downfall of popery till 2060. Okay, we got another 40 years to go. Let us examine these 3 epochs a little more particularly and see how they correspond with the present state of the world and of the papacy. We feel satisfied that we are warranted to make the era of Justinian the primary commencement, at least, of the 1260 years. At that epoch, we should behold At that epoch we behold the 10 kingdoms risen, governed by Roman law, with Christ's vicar placed in arrogant and blasphemous supremacy over them. If to that we are to add 1260 years, we are brought down, as we have said, to 1793, the era of the French Revolution. How does that period correspond? Was there any similarity between the rise of the papacy in 533 and its fall in 1793? A very striking similarity. The Code of Justinian first recognized the Pope's absolute ecclesiastical supremacy, which properly constitutes him the Antichrist and is the basis of all the power he claims over temporal potentates. At the French Revolution, the leading kingdom in conventional Europe disavowed and formally abolished his supremacy. The clergy were declared totally independent of the See of Rome, and the choice of bishops was vested in the departmental authorities. The manifold calamities of which the revolution was productive to the papacy, we shall have a future occasion of stating. We only here farther remark that the tremendous blow then inflicted on Rome, she has somewhat repaired, but is very far from having fully recovered. The second epoch, that of Focus, AD 606, brings us to 1866. All admit that the Pope was by this time vested in the title and powers of Christ's vicar. The general consent on this point warrants the conclusion that at this era there was a fuller manifestation of Antichrist, that now at least he was fully come, and that at the corresponding era of 1866 he will be fully and finally destroyed. But though the papal system will then, in all likelihood, be broken up and swept away, remnants of popery may remain, and the full glory of the millennium, consisting in the restoration of the Jews and the full conversion of the Gentile world, may not be realized till toward 2000, forming a third period corresponding to the era of Charlemagne. Wow, gee whiz, look at that. Looks like James Aiken Wylie is correct in that view. Because here we are in 2020 reading his book from 1848. Daniel speaks of two periods, one of 30 and the other of 45 years, making 75 years in all, which are to be added to the 1260 days. And from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination that maketh desolate set up, there shall be 1,290 days, unquote, which are just 30 days added to the 1260. 30 years after the termination of the 1260 years, we may expect some event bearing with decided effect on the downfall of Antichrist. But a still and more blessed change may be expected 45 years after that again. For it is added, quote, "Blessed is he that waiteth and cometh to the 1,305 and 30 days." Let me read that again. "Blessed is he that waiteth and cometh to the 1,305 and 30 days." If we make the era of Justinian, AD 533, or rather 530, for he began the promulgation of his code in 530, the commencement of the 1260 years, they will end in 1790. And adding 30 years to that epoch, we are brought down to 1820, the era of the Greek insurrection, the pouring out of the sixth vial, as we shall afterward show, so that the waters of the symbolic Euphrates might be dried up and preparation made for the catastrophe. In another 45 years, which brings us to 1865, according to Daniel, a blessed era shall begin, the millennium, most probably ushered in by the complete destruction of Antichrist. It is a remarkable coincidence that in the rise of Antichrist there were 75 years between his primary appearance at the era of Justinian and his secondary at the era of Phocas. And we find an era of corresponding length in his predicted downfall extending from the French Revolution to 1865. Which most probably marks the epoch of his consummated ruin, the interval being filled up with the plagues of the consummation. But there are some who maintain that the rise of the papacy cannot be dated earlier than AD 800, when the Pope became a temporal sovereign, having, by the help of Charlemagne, completed his conquest of the three of the 10 princes, and incorporated their territories with the patrimony of St. Peter. Such base their conclusion on the symbol employed in Daniel to represent him, the little horn, which, say they, imports his temporal sovereignty, and that therefore till he appeared as a horn, that is a temporal sovereign, he could not be said to be risen. It appears to us that such confound the accidents with the essence of the papacy. We know not on what ground it is asserted that a horn cannot symbolize an ecclesiastical ruler, especially when the ecclesiastical authority is of so absolute and sweeping a character as to involve the possession and exercise of temporal dominion. Whether the person vested in that ecclesiastical authority, be nominally the head of the temporal kingdom or no? The following considerations, we think, will be deemed satisfactory. First, the prediction respecting the 3 horns that were to be plucked up before the little horn is not given in the Apocalypse at all, a circumstance that satisfies us that great stress is not to be placed upon it. Second, the plucking up of the 3 horns is represented in Daniel as subsequent to the rise of the little horn. The words are, quote, "The other which came up, and before whom 3 fell," unquote. Quote, "Another shall rise after them, and another shall rise after them, and he shall be diverse from the first, and he shall subdue 3 kings," unquote. Thus, the symbol represents him as existing previous to the subjugation of the 3 horns, and exhibits their subjugation as his act. It follows that Antichrist was a horn before he had any temporal kingdom. Third, it is expressly said that this horn was diverse from the others. To what can this refer? But to the fact that while they were secular rulers, he was an ecclesiastical potentate. Yeah, I'm just checking to see how many. Okay. Ecclesiastical potentate. If the horn symbolizes him only as a temporal prince, it could have been affirmed on no good ground that he was diverse from the others. Fourth, the temporal power of the Pope springs out of his ecclesiastical authority. His having a temporal kingdom was, if we may so speak, a mere accident. It was not that which gave him his temporal authority, although he had never been sovereign of the Papal States. His temporal dominion would have been not the less unbounded and supreme. It grew out of his claim as vicar, or Christ's vicar, and though he had never had a single soldier nor a single acre of territory, he would, as vicar of Christ, have been supreme over the kings of the earth. It is this claim that constitutes him the Antichrist, a claim that involves in it supreme dominion, temporal as well as spiritual. And to us, it appears a matter of no moment at what time he obtained his insignificant patrimony, seeing his supreme dominion was neither in point of theory nor in point of fact founded on that, the moment that the Bishop of Rome avowed himself the vicar of Christ, and had that claim acknowledged, the Antichrist was come. Then he had a character allowed him which placed him above sovereigns, entitled him to dispose of their crowns and kingdoms, and to press into his service, when occasion required, the revenues and armies of Europe. This claim, we have already shown, was first admitted by Justinian in 530, and more formally and fully recognized by Phocas in 606. These 75 years form a broad line marking off the era of the reign of Antichrist and the 1260 days of sackcloth to the witnesses, and a line of equal breadth will mark the termination of his reign, filled up by two terrible catastrophes, the first of which the first of which we have already seen. The last is most probably opening upon us. The former symbolized in the Apocalypse by the harvest, and the latter by the vintage. There is another consideration which adds great force to our conclusion, a consideration which is ably stated by Mr. Eliot in his great work, All the Great Lines of Prophecy. However remote to the point whence they take their rise in the past, converge in our era. In the 9th chapter of Daniel's prophecy, we find the longest prophetic number anywhere in the Bible, 2,300 days, forming the limiting period of the defilement of the Eastern Christendom by the Mohammedan abomination. Quote, "Then I heard one saint speaking, and another saint said unto that certain saint which spake, How long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice and the transgression of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden under foot? And he said unto me, unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed." Unquote. No time is specified from which the commencement of the 2,300 days is to be dated, and we are left at liberty to select the most marked epoch in the history of the power by which the sanctuary was to be defiled. Some commentators have dated it from the year BC 165, when the temple was defiled by Antiochus, but there is no authority for this in the prophecy itself. There is more probability in the epoch fixed on by Mr. Eliot, that of the acme. It's getting dark to read. Excuse me. Yeah. The ACME, the acme of the Persian ram's conquering power, which was seen in the vision pushing westward and northward and southward, counting from BC 480, when Xerxes made his triumphant progress to invade Greece. The 2,300 prophetic days bring us down to the year AD 1820, the year of the Greek insurrection, when Greek Christendom began to be cleansed from the Turk and his religion. Mr. Eliot is not alone in his selection of this period, and according to this calculation, the termination of these days falls within the noted 75 years assigned by Daniel for the time of the consummation. Again, it is highly probable that the 7 years instantly and bestially of Nebuchadnezzar were typical of the moral and political madness with which the 4 monarchies, of which he was the golden head, were to be smitten. If so, and if we calculate from BC 727, when the Assyrians under Shalmaneser first, quote, came down like a wolf on the fold, unquote, of Israel, we find the, quote, 7 times, unquote, of the aberration of